have a prayer sheet for prayers? Yeah, maybe, yeah. Extra. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, good evening, here and online. And today we're going to talk about the most exciting aspect of our life, suffering. Not only suffering, but also other things, okay? Yeah, so there's a model on SAMSARA, yeah, suffering. And NIRVANA means to be liberated from suffering, yeah? We're going to talk about what is suffering and how to get out of the cycle of suffering. So, yeah, and then before we start the session, maybe important to generate correct motivation. Think that you're here to know more about the mind and to understand more about samsara and to understand more about how to achieve the state of liberation or nirvana, so to say, right? Yeah. Maybe it needs a chair. Yeah. There's place, no, on that side. Yeah. So try to generate motivation in those lines that we're here together in order to understand more about the mind, more about samsara, how to get out of samsara, and with that knowledge also be able to help others to achieve the same. Yeah, so try to generate that kind of motivation for yourself. And then in front you can imagine Sakyamuni Buddha surrounded by the masters of India, Tibet and the other Buddhist traditions. And surrounding yourself, imagine countless beings undergoing the individual sufferings and think it's your responsibility to do something about it or a wish to help them. And with that wish you can think you start with leading them in the prayers, right? Yeah, so recite the prayers together, so you have on the sheet.
To the Founder, the Endowed Transcendent Destroyer, the One Gone Beyond, the Foe Destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you the completely and fully awakened one, the Endowed Transcendent Destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. To the Founder, the Endowed Transcendent Destroyer, the One Gone Beyond, the Foe Destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the Endowed Transcendent Destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. To the Founder, the Endowed Transcendent Destroyer, the One Gone Beyond, the Foe Destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the Endowed Transcendent Destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. To the indescribable, inconceivable and inexpressible perfection of wisdom, unproduced, unceasing, the nature of space, object of the uniquely knowing transcendental wisdom, to the mother of the victorious ones of the three times I prostrate. Tayata, gate gate, paragate, parasamgate bodhi soha. Tayata, gate gate, paragate, parasamgate bodhi soha. Tayata, gate gate, paragate, parasamgate bodhi soha.
Sangye
Chodang soke chonam la janje pade dakne kyapsu chi dage chionyen gipe sonam ki jola penche sangye ju pa sho sangye chodang soke chonam la janje pade dakne kyapsu chi dage chionyen gipe sonam ki jola penche sangye ju pa sho sangye chodang soke chonam la janje pade dakne kyapsu chi dage chionyen gipe sonam ki jola penche sangye ju pa sho.
Yeah, so yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. The model is samsara and nirvana. Yeah, so as we talked about before, samsara is not somewhere in space, or you need a place also to sit. Take a cushion, no? Yeah. No. Otherwise, 1 minute is okay, but more minutes and it's not okay. Yeah. So samsara and nirvana, they basically are not in a particular location, right? Samsara is not in a particular location, although it is related with a particular location. But it doesn't mean that samsara is there and nirvana is over there or something like that. That's not really the case, right? So we talked about before, I think samsara is basically an aspect of what we call a contaminated continuity of consciousness. Yeah, that means as long as you have karma and afflictions, and we'll come to that later, as long as you have karma and afflictions, you have this contaminated aspect of consciousness, right? So as long as you have afflictions like anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, for example, you create causes for suffering. Yeah, so as long as you have those afflictions, you're basically bound in samsara, you know. And that also with karma, and we talked about karma a little bit before in the kasa, the model on karma. But yeah, we come to that in more detail maybe next week or the week after, when we're going to talk about the 12 links, how actually the cycle of samsara, samsara you could translate also as cyclic existence, right? So this is a kind of a cycle, how we are going around in samsara. Yeah, and that cycle depends on various aspects of in the 12 links, as we're going to discuss later on, that you die and then you are reborn, right? And the way we are reborn in samsara is kind of an aspect that is not controlled. We're not controlled over our future lifetimes. Right? So that's in Buddhism, we are our own creator for the future, so to say. We don't believe in a particular creator as such. We are our own creator. And we create our own kind of samsara in the future. Or we can create nirvana. Yeah, so samsara is this contaminated aspect of going around in cyclic existence, and we're going to talk about it more in detail when we're going to discuss the 12 links of dependent origination, maybe next week or the week after. So that's kind of how we wander around in samsara, or you could say cyclic existence, or how we actually moving around in a kind of a circle, you know, of what we say contaminated birth, sickness, aging, and death. Yeah, so that's kind of what we call the 4 rivers of samsaric suffering. Yeah, so birth is not that. It looks all kind of, when we see, oh, look at this new baby born, so cute, you know. Everybody thinks like that, but actually, if you are the baby at that time, it's not that cute, because they mostly come out crying, right? They're not like, hello everybody, here I am, I'm so happy to be on this planet, so happy to be with you guys. That doesn't happen, right? The baby comes out in you know, being squeezed, and you know, it's a very intense experience, right? To be born is a very intense experience. You know, to come out of this liquid kind of in the womb, and then all of a sudden in the dry air, and you have to breathe, and then all this strange eyes upon you, and then they put you on this for you it's like sandpaper, but we consider it as a soft towel in the human realm. But if you come out just for the first time, it's quite intense, to think really about birth. It's not that nice and beautiful as we sometimes think it is, right? If you are that, of course, we forgot that suffering, but that doesn't mean when you are this newborn, at that moment there's suffering. Right? So that's what we're talking about, right? So that's the suffering of birth, and then there's the suffering of growing up. Yeah, you know, right? I don't have to tell too much about these things. We know that, suffering of growing up. First, you cannot really talk. You're hungry or thirsty, or you have fear, or you cannot express that when you're young, right? So you just cry or hope for the best, basically. So that means that to learn the language is very difficult initially, right? And then learn how to walk, learn how to go to the toilet. You're full with stuff, and then you have to ask your people who took care of you to make sure, your father, your mother, or somebody else, to make sure they take away the dirty stuff, right? Yeah. And then, all the hassle of growing up, education, friends, losing friends, having friends, getting new friends, not getting new friends. Or, there's a lot of hassle actually in growing up, right? And then with your education, especially as a teenager, I think most people have all this kind of period. You're either depressed, or you're very low, or even sometimes suicidal thoughts, because you don't have a clue about life, right? And you're just doing this education, or this school, or college, or high school, whatsoever, but just completely sometimes confused what I'm doing, or what should I be doing, So that's kind of a very, I think, quite a common aspect, and then problems in family, father, mother, problems with father and mother, or problems with friends, or in school there's trouble, or the studies don't go well, and then you want to study something else, and then you finish your graduation, and then you have to work, and then actually you don't like this job, you want to actually do another job, So that's quite a lot of hassle involved in a human life, right? If you really analyze correctly. And then you get sick. And also, that's the thing. You get sick. And then you get sick, but you don't like to get sick, right? And when you're sick, you think, why now? I don't have time to be sick, right? But it happens, that's what it is. It happens beyond control. That's what we're talking about. The suffering of birth happens beyond control. The suffering of sickness happens beyond control, right? Because we cannot stop it at the moment we're experiencing suffering. In a similar way, old age, also we cannot stop. There's so many commercials you can follow, or to believe that, if you use this cream or this shampoo and you stop your hairline from redrawing backwards or something like that, don't believe them, okay? That's not really going to work. You are getting gray, you're getting older, and then gums redrawing, hairlines redrawing, and then physically things become more difficult, and then after 50, 60 years of age, then it's down the hill, basically. The body just starts decaying, right? The doctors always like to say something very nice. Oh, sir, you need glasses because at that particular age, your eyes have to be adjusted. That's what they say. They don't say, hey, look, you're getting old and it's all degenerating and you need some glasses now. They don't say that, right? But that's a reality, That's a reality that this decay and old age happens, and then all the mental aspects that comes along with it. You okay? That sound?
The translator is finding it quite low, so we're just turning it up.
Okay. Yeah. So, is okay? Yeah. Yeah. I don't know who's translating that because they're in the Nunye now, I think. A few. Yeah. You can hear me okay? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I don't have to start over again, huh? Again, the suffering of birth, sickness, and aging. Because that's the cycle, you see. It's not just once, but it goes again and again, So, yeah, joking aside, but then you get older, and then also there is a lot of suffering, And the thing is, and then you die. There's kind of, that's kind of what we call samsaric, contaminated states of existence, contaminated birth, sickness, aging, and death. Yeah, so that, why do we say contaminated? Because it's contaminated by the power of karma and afflictions. There's no control. In a similar way, when you go to bed and you want to have a nice good night's sleep and you want to have a nice dream, for example, right? The majority of the people, they're not capable of controlling what happens during the dream state, you know. So in a similar way, when you die, you don't have control. We ordinary beings do not have control over the next life. It's just cause and effect relationships, right? In the dream, very similar, the things that come up in your dream is just habituation patterns of that day or previous days or in that life, right? Or previous lives sometimes, you know. So that means that the habituation pattern, that's what we say, we create our own future, right? So it's all in the mind, as we say. Yeah, we are our own creator of the future. So that being the case, if you contemplate suffering again and again, then you generate, so the first aspect is understanding suffering, and then understand the cause of suffering, right? That as long as you have karma and afflictions, you're basically stuck. Yeah, a sickness is beyond control, right? So you can hear that, no? People with intense pain in a sickness, they just said, "Oh, I felt I'm stuck in this body," or something like that. That means there is no control. People want to get better, but at that time, it's not possible, right? So that's kind of what we call contaminated states of existence. Yeah, that means as long as you have karma and afflictions, affliction actually create, we come to that. Affliction is the kind of the cause for suffering, as well as karma. Or karma, as we discussed before, is not something magical, play or something like that. No. Karma is nothing else. Nothing else. It's quite a complex system, right? Karma is what we call cause and effect relationships within the continuity of consciousness. Yeah, we have external cause and effect relationships. If you have a seed, you put it in the soil with some fertilization and heat and moisture, it grows into a sprout, right, and into a plant. Yeah? So that's an external cause and effect relationship. Yeah? And there's various laws in nature, and we can study them and understand the laws of nature, right? In a similar way, we have the laws of the mind. Yeah, that within the mind also we have cause and effect relationships, and there's laws in that aspect. That anger produces suffering, for example, is an aspect of karma, right? That when you get irritated, it creates a kind of suffering in the mind, you know. So, or strong desire, whatever affliction that arises, creates a disturbance in the mind, you know. So, looking at those aspects, then you see that is also karma. Yeah, there's a cause and effect relationship within the continuity of consciousness that creates suffering, you know. Yeah. So then it becomes very complex if you have physical and verbal activities and mental activities. Yeah. Every physical, verbal, and mental activity we engage in on a daily basis, right? Every split second there's mental activity. There's a thought, or there's a perception, or there's an experience. You know? So that means all those different types of moments, of actions, that information is not lost. That's what we say, right? It's like karma is nothing else than just potentials of activities of body, speech, and mind that you carry over time. Yeah, so information is not lost, you know. So that's a very interesting aspect of Buddhism. Some people find karma very complex. And we talked about it already quite a few times during the model on karma. It is very complex, but also in science, the similar aspects are very, very complex. You know, if you really want to study how information is carried over time, it's a very big question in biology, neuroscience, quantum mechanics, whatever field of science you engage in, there is a big question about how is information stored and how is information carried over time. Yeah, so there's a lot of big questions there. In Buddhism, we say this information partly is in relation with karma, right? So that there is a kind of, as David Bohm calls it, hidden variables, you could say, in kind of implicate order or an implicant aspect of reality that exists, right? We cannot completely understand it, we cannot completely examine it, but it exists, yeah, and it has a correlation with the things we can measure and see, So that's kind of, certain aspects of karma are very challenging, but when you put it into the scientific perspective, then it's a very interesting material, that there are aspects of karma very, very much in accordance with what we find in quantum mechanics, for example. That's very interesting, how information is actually stored and carried over time and has an influence in future moments of existence of certain forms of matter. In a similar way, with consciousness, exactly the same thing, that we create our own future, and we, by the power of the cause and effect relationships and the nature of interdependence, so to say, we create various forms of suffering or happiness. Yeah? So positive states of mind create happiness, and negative states of mind create suffering. Yeah? So that's basically what we call karma in a very brief explanation, as we went over karma already in the model on karma itself. So you don't have to go, you can review that material if you wish, So, yeah, so we have the suffering. Yeah, we talked about birth, sickness, aging, and death. Yeah, and then the various aspects that go along with that suffering. Mental sufferings and things you like to accomplish but you cannot, or you don't want to meet certain circumstances but you have to meet. And then the aspect of never being satisfied. Yeah, so if you look all those aspects of samsaric suffering, then you see, wow, there is something that is actually unwanted, So that's what the Buddha, the first teaching of the Buddha said. The Buddha said, this is suffering. And then referring to the contaminated aggregates, or the contaminated body and mind. Yeah, so the contaminated body and mind means as long as you have karma and afflictions, there is suffering. So the Buddha says, this is suffering. Yeah, so, yeah, that's a kind of the first teaching of the Buddha. Can you imagine? The first teaching of the Buddha was just about suffering. Yeah, so not to make people depressed, but to actually let people wake up. If you have a life and you're never really aware of the difficulties in life, you will never improve your life, right? Yeah, so there's many people who always think, yeah, that's how I am and that's how it is, and that's how I will always be like that. Yeah, so that's an aspect of life you can change. You can change, right? Yeah. So that's why the Buddha, he was so kind to shake us up and out of this ignorance of not understanding samsara. So he said, look, there is suffering. Yeah, so he said, this is suffering. That's the first thing the Buddha said. Then the second thing, because if you have a problem and you see the problem but you don't address the problem, you will never solve it, right? Yeah, so that's what the Buddha said. This is suffering. The second thing he said, you should know suffering. Yeah, so you should know suffering doesn't mean, the Buddha said, you should know a headache is a headache, or a fever is a fever and that's unwanted. That's not really knowing suffering, because everybody has that same feeling, right? If you have a cold, you take some vitamin C, or you get some good food, some good sleep, and maybe pop some paracetamol or whatsoever. So that means that to see the suffering, the suffering of suffering, as we call it, is not too difficult to recognize, right? Yeah, most people on the planet, they can recognize that. So when the Buddha said you should know suffering, the Buddha didn't say you should know the suffering of suffering. That's the first suffering. We divide into what we call the three types of suffering. Yeah? So the suffering of suffering means a manifest form of suffering, like a sickness or depression, yeah. So the suffering of suffering is the first among what we call the three types of suffering. Yeah, a manifest form of suffering, very easy to recognize. But the Buddha said you should know suffering. It didn't refer to this aspect. He said you should know suffering. And then he said it's not the suffering of suffering, the first one. It's also not the second one, the suffering of change. Yeah, so the suffering of change, when you're hungry and you really want to have some nice food, and yeah. Sorry, I've been in India too long, so I always tell my Indian friends, like, have a very heavy-duty Punjabi dinner with a lot of ghee, and late in the evening, and then you wake up in the morning and your mind is dull, and you might have a stomachache, right? So that means that there's a suffering of change, that we we expect something of a nice meal, but actually transform into suffering. Or you go for a nice walk, and you go somewhere to a park, and there's wind and pollen, and you get a hay fever, and then the drink is not as you expected it to be, a fancy drink. You think, oh, nice fancy drink in a park, and then it's all different. Yeah. So you can see that there is a suffering of change. Yeah. You expect things, but actually the activity which you thought was the cause for happiness actually transforms into suffering. Yeah, so that's what we call the second type of suffering, the suffering of change. Yeah, or people complain when it's too cold and too overcast, and then one day we have a little bit of sun, and then people complain it's too hot. Isn't it? It's kind of, yeah, it's never okay. Yeah, it's really true, right? So that means that is kind of the suffering of change. We want to have nice weather, and then it's nice weather for a few days, and actually we want to have rain again, and then there's rain for a few days, and then we want to have sun again. Yeah, so that's kind of what we call the suffering of change. You know, and that's also not in our control, right? The first suffering of suffering is not in our control. When you have a sickness or depression, it just happens to, not just happens, of course. It gets triggered by certain causes and conditions, right? But when you're in it, you cannot really get out of it straight away. When you're sick or when you're depressed, you want to get out of it, but it doesn't happen like that. It's not that easy, you know. So that means there's a suffering of suffering, easy to recognize. The suffering of change is a little bit more difficult because it's tricky, you know. That you see an outing or a nice meal or the newest phone you're gonna buy, it might be quite expensive, and then you have it, and then actually it breaks down, or the computer breaks down, and then there's more suffering. It's a kind of the suffering of change. Or too hot, you go in the shade, and it's too cold, you go in the hot sun again. So there's no real satisfaction, right? Or people on the beach, they lay on the beach, and then the sun is too hot, and then they go in the water, but then the water is too cold, so they come out of the water, and then in the sun again, and then, you know, there's no end, basically. You know what I'm talking about, right? There's a kind of, what we call the suffering of change, you know. That's also because we have contaminated aggregates. There is no satisfaction to be obtained, you know. Yeah, so that's kind of what we call the second type of suffering, the suffering of change, right? So the first one, suffering of suffering. The second one, the suffering of change. Yeah. So also when the Buddha said you should know suffering, he didn't mention this particular one, the suffering of change, because that's quite easy to recognize. Even dogs and cats, when it's too hot in the sun, they go to the shade, and when it's too cold in the shade, they go into the sun, right? They can recognize that aspect of suffering. So the Buddha said you should know suffering. The Buddha mentioned the all-pervasive form of suffering. Yeah, so that means all-pervasive means it's everywhere, from the tip of your toe to the crown of your head. You know, you just have to put a needle somewhere or put some fire somewhere on your body, and you know there's suffering. So that means your body is just, at the moment, we quite comfortable, but it just has to be triggered. The suffering is sitting just underneath the surface. Yeah, that's what we call with the all-pervasive compounding form of suffering. You just have to get a cold that gets triggered by being tired and a little bit of drop in the temperature, and then those little conditions, they just influence you and you get sick, right? So that means as long as you have these causes and conditions to get sick, then you have suffering. That's a much more profound insight into suffering, right? That the Buddha said, you should know suffering. The Buddha said you should know the all-pervasive form of suffering. That means that the suffering is just sitting there underneath the surface. You know, it just has to get triggered by a particular external condition or an internal condition, and there you go. You know, so that's kind of what we say, the all-pervasive form of suffering from the point of view of our contaminated body and our contaminated mind, but also in samsara. You know, wherever you go in samsara, you can go. You can be born as humans. You can be reborn as animals or spirits or hell beings. We didn't talk about it yet. Yeah. Maybe another time. So, and you can be born as gods, and you know. So that means you can be born in various states of cyclic existence. You know, certain states with more suffering, other states with more happiness. But even when you're born as a god, you know, you might have a very long life and just blissing out all the time, and so much happiness. But that also comes to an end. Yeah, so that means if you do not eliminate afflictions, there is no escape. For example, we have this kind of techniques of achieving calm abiding, or what we call samatha meditation, right? The samatha, kind of the quietness of the mind, that you can abide on your object according to your wish. As long as you abide in that state, there's no suffering, So the gods is very similar to that. But if you do not eliminate afflictions, when you come out of that state, you can still trigger afflictions and get angry again. Yeah, there's this famous story about this meditator, because if you have calm abiding, we come to that later, maybe a little bit in autumn. So if you have calm abiding, you can sit without food, or after some time, if you have the realization, you don't need food anymore, no drinks anymore. You just live on what we call the Tenzin Geshe, or the food of samadhi, So you can go to that extreme that you can live in a mountain, or in the mountains without food or drinks for days or weeks or months. That's this accomplishment is there if you have calm abiding. But if you do not eliminate afflictions, it's just a temporary escape. Yeah. So there's this story about this guy whose hair was very long, and then the nails also grow, of course, and then this little mouse came and thought, oh, nice hair, and nice warm. I'm gonna make a nest here, and then was making a nest, and then was biting in the skin. And this person who was in this blissful meditation went, he woke up and thought, who did this to me? And then he found out this little mouse did it. He got so angry that he died and was reborn in the lower state of existence. That's kind of the traditional story, so to say. But it gives a kind of symbolic meaning to it, that if you have just a mere peace of mind without eliminating afflictions, it's just a temporary solution. It's not an ultimate solution, right? So that means as long as you still, even those people in the God realms, they still have afflictions. At the moment, they not manifest. So it looks like there's no suffering. But, so that's what we call the all-pervasive aspect. Means wherever you are in samsara, wherever you are, there is always a kind of suffering. There's no escape as long as you have karma and afflictions. Yeah, we talked about all people do world trips when you have some, finish your studies. Many people, people still do that, but in our time it was quite a thing to do. Yeah, you finish your education, you get some money, work hard for a few months, and then do a world trip, before you start with your serious life or something like that. But then people, they travel, but they go to a new place, get bored, go to another place, get bored, to another place, get bored, and then until they find out, actually, wherever I go, I take my mind with me. So the place itself is not bringing real happiness, right? It's kind of, when you don't train your mind, then you can go wherever you like, but it's just the same pattern over and over again, right? So that means there's another aspect, the simple aspect of this all-pervasive aspect. If you don't train your mind, if you don't eliminate afflictions, you are stuck in samsara. And there's always this potential to suffer. Yeah, it might go well for a certain period of time, and might be quite happy for a certain period of time, but that can come to an end like that. And we see that people who thought they never get a heart attack, or they never got a cancer, or they never had all forms of diseases or strokes or whatsoever, they never thought that will happen to them. Or people were dying, people with just a few weeks left of their life. They never thought that would happen to them. That's kind of the thing, that's kind of this contaminated aspect of samsara that we cannot stop. That's this all-pervasive aspect of suffering. So when the Buddha said you should know suffering, he said you should understand this all-pervasive, compounded form of suffering, as we say. Yeah, so that means basically as long as you have karma and afflictions, there is no escape. So that's kind of important to understand. When the Buddha said the first noble truth, you should know suffering. Yeah, so then he was referring to this particular form of suffering, the all-pervasive aspect of suffering. As long as you have karma and afflictions, there's no escape. So that's kind of, yeah. So did I say we're going to do the Four Noble Truths already or not? No. But that's what we're going to do. Yeah. So the first one is the truth of suffering, right? That's the first noble truth. That's the first teaching the Buddha gave in Varanasi after achieving enlightenment. People here in the hall, they can see that plaque on the wall there in the corner. That's the first time the Buddha actually taught 5 disciples there in Kasa, in Deer Park, in Sarnath near Varanasi. So that's the first teaching the Buddha gave, the 4 Noble Truths. And then the first teaching among the 4 is the first one is the truth of suffering. And then the Buddha said this is suffering, referring to the contaminated aggregates, and then said you should know suffering. Yeah, so you should know suffering, referring to this all-pervasive compounded form of suffering. As long as you have karma and afflictions, there's no escape. Yeah, that's kind of what the Buddha said in the first teaching. Then you think, okay, there's a problem here. We have a problem. Yeah, this is Houston. We have a problem. It's not a simple problem like that. Yeah, that's a probably easy fix problem, right? But we have a more sophisticated problem. So similar, if you have a sickness, you want to know the nature of the sickness, right? So you go to the doctor and you say, what is the nature of the sickness? You know, that's very important to know. You know, if you know the nature of the sickness, then the second question is, what is the cause of the sickness? Yeah, in a similar way, the Buddha said, okay, this is suffering. You should know suffering. Yeah. Then the Buddha said, the cause. This is the cause of suffering. You should abandon the cause of suffering. So there's different terminology being used, right? You should eliminate the cause of suffering. Yeah. So what is the cause of suffering? The second noble truth is twofold, right? It's karma and afflictions. As long as you have karma and afflictions, there is no escape from suffering. Yeah. So karma and afflictions, those two are the cause of suffering. Yeah. And we already talked about the nature of suffering from the point of view of you should know the all-pervasive form of suffering or the all-pervasive compounded form of suffering. So that already indicates as long as you have the cause of suffering, there's no escape. So what is the cause of suffering? Karma and afflictions. Yeah. So karma is nothing else, as we talked about, than potentials in your mind or in your continuity of consciousness that can get triggered to meet a particular condition, and then you suffer in a sickness or mental difficulty or depression whatsoever. Yeah. So karma, nothing in Buddhism, we don't believe in random events. Nothing is random. Everything is caused by causes and conditions. There is no randomness. You know. Like Einstein, he said God plays dice, but that's not in Buddhism. We don't accept that. You know, that aspect. So also in quantum mechanics, that's been solved after with Carlo Rovelli, for example, and David Bohm. Yeah, but anyway. So they also put forward more cause and effect relationships, and then things are not that spooky anymore, as Einstein said, in certain aspects of quantum mechanics. Because if you really look in the bigger picture, and you can combine relativity with quantum mechanics, then things are not that spooky anymore, right? So by David Bohm and Carlo Rovelli, for example. Yeah. Okay. So that means that nothing is random. Everything is based on causes and conditions. And that's also true for our sickness, for our depression. Everything in life is created by previous moments of consciousness, behavior, patterns, whatever you like to call it. Yeah? So karma is a very essential aspect of reality in the continuity of our being or in the continuity of our consciousness. You know? So karma is nothing else than cause and effect relationships in our continuity of consciousness. And we also know that our experience is very personal, is very subjective, right? So that's not a proof that karma is a kind of within the continuity of a particular individual. You know, that we have individual forms of experience of the same kind of event or going out or a particular type of food, or so we all have different experiences because karma is individual based, right? Yeah. So that is kind of, we talked about it already a little bit more elaborate in the module on karma, so I don't go too much detail, but it's just nothing else than the continuity of course, in fact, relationships within the continuity of the person, as we say. Yeah, so that creates suffering. Yeah. So yeah, the two aspects of the cause of suffering is karma and afflictions. Yeah. So you go to the doctor, you say, okay, what's the nature of the sickness? You analyze that. Then you see what is the cause of the sickness. You analyze that. Yeah. So the Buddha taught exactly the same way. You have a problem, and then you analyze the nature of the problem. Next step is you analyze the cause of the problem. Yeah. The second noble truth, the cause of the problem, and the cause of the problem should be abandoned. Yeah. So the suffering, the truth of suffering, should be known, right? The Buddha said you should know suffering, and you should abandon the cause of suffering. Yeah, so that's what the Buddha said. You should abandon the cause or eliminate the cause of suffering. Because if you know suffering, then you have a question: what is the cause? And then if you eliminate suffering, there is no result of suffering, right? So that's why the Buddha had this particular language. Okay, that's the second noble truth. The third noble truth is the truth of cessation. Yeah, cessation, or the absence of suffering. Yeah, so the Buddha said you should manifest the truth of cessation. Yeah, so that means you should make it happen. You should make it happen that your mind is free of afflictions. Yeah, cessation of suffering means cessation of the cause of suffering, right? If your mind is free of afflictions, then you are free of the cause of suffering. Yeah, so that's what the Buddha said. You should manifest the true cessation. Remember, we went over refuge, the previous model. Yeah, and in the refuge model, we talked about the Dharma being the actual refuge, and then what is this Dharma jewel is the absence of afflictions, and the direct perception of emptiness we talked about. Yeah, that are the two aspects of the Dharma jewel that we discussed briefly. So here it comes the same thing comes in discussion, that the true cessation, right, is this absence of afflictions. Yeah, so if your mind is free of a particular affliction, like let's say your mind is free of anger, right, after meditating on patience for a very long period of time. Yeah, so we talk about let's say decades. Yeah, and then you also realize emptiness another few lifetimes down the line, and then with that realization you eliminate anger, for example, right? So then your mind is free of anger. Yeah, so that's a cessation, an absence of anger. That's what we call a true cessation, right? An absence of a particular affliction in your continuity of consciousness. Yeah. So your mind being free or separated from an affliction is called what we call a cessation. And the Buddha said you should make that manifest. You should make that happen. And also in the model of refuge or safe direction, so to say, we say in Buddhism, of course, we take refuge in the external Buddha, Sakyamuni, and you know, the realizations and absence of suffering and those kind of aspects. But the real refuge we talked about is the resultant refuge, right? That your own mind being free of afflictions, that for us is kind of the real safe direction, right? If your mind is free of anger, if your mind is free of depression, if your mind is free of negative thoughts, that's a real safe direction, right? That's what we call refuge. So as a Buddhist, we say we nangpa, means we inner beings. Yeah, we don't look in a rescue outside of our mind. Of course, we need help, you know, and we depend upon the teachings of the Buddha, but the real safe direction comes to put those teachings into practice and to make it happen in your own mind, right? So that's very important to know, because the Buddha said, you know, I cannot wash away your sins, I cannot take away your suffering, I cannot give my realizations to you, but I can show you how to do it. You know, that's kind of, we have to do our own homework, but we can follow the path or the method the Buddha explained, you know. Yeah. So then the Buddha said you should manifest the true cessation, meaning if you really want to be free of these first two truths, the truth of suffering and the true cause of suffering, you should make this cessation manifest. Same if you're sick, you go to the doctor, what is the nature of the sickness? What is the cause of the sickness? Then the third question will be, can I get cured? If you cannot get cured, then, why should you continue in same thing here? No? If there's no end to suffering, we're wasting our time here, to be honest. Yeah. So luckily it's possible. Otherwise, I won't be here. I tell you. Yeah. So and you won't be here either properly. Yeah. Because it's just kind of little talk, like you can watch the news instead, and there's not much difference, right? Yeah. But luckily, there's a possibility of eliminating suffering. So that's why we're here, basically. That it's possible. The doctor said it's possible to get cured. The Buddha said it's possible to eliminate suffering, right? Because of this truth of cessation, it's possible, And we talked about, I think, already quite a few times, especially in the beginning of this course, for those who started in the beginning, that there are reasons why you can eliminate afflictions, right? Why can we eliminate these destructive emotions? Because, as we saw before, they are not an innate part of your mind. That means they're not always present. Yeah, they like the blue sky is always remains blue, right? It doesn't get obscured by the overcast of the clouds. And in a similar way, deep down below, our most purity of the mind gets never really influenced by afflictions. It's just temporarily obscured by it. Yeah, but it doesn't really influence. Because when you make that pure mind manifest, as long as it manifests, there is no suffering. There is no afflictions, right, of the desire realm. So that means that's all possible, So that means afflictions are not an innate part of the mind. Yeah, they like the clouds obscuring the blue sky, but if you go above the clouds, it's still a blue sky, right? They're not really a part of the blue sky. Yes, we talked about. In a similar way, afflictions, they come, abide, and disintegrate by causes and conditions, right? So at the moment, I hope you're not angry at me or angry at what we're talking about. Oh, suffering again, no. Yeah. So that means that afflictions are depending on causes and conditions, right? But I can trigger it when I talk about your hairstyle or your dress or your tattoo or your headphone, people on the line, and glasses or something like that. And then I said some very nasty things about you, and then you say, oh, Namdak, don't say that to me. I'm not like it. And then you get angry very easily, I mean, very easily, I don't know. I didn't try it yet. But you can get angry, right? So that means that anger is not omnipresent, as we call it. The afflictions are not omnipresent. So that's a reason why they actually can be taken away as well, because they're just very temporary. And they come by the power of causes and conditions. So if you play with causes and conditions, you can do something about it, right? That's the second reason why we say that afflictions can be eliminated, The first reason was that they're not an innate part of the blue sky kind of thing, right? The afflictions are not an innate part of our pure nature of the mind. Yeah. The second reason is that not omnipresent. They depend on causes and conditions. They impermanent, as we call it, right? So afflictions come. For example, you wake up in the morning, you have a good dream, and you actually want to go back to experience the same happiness in the dream. But yeah, not possible. You have to move on. And then you see this annoying message of a person or somebody tells you something. Then straight away your mind completely transforms into a happy mind to a kind of mind that is really irritated. Yeah. Yeah. So you can see, and then you're stuck for some time. I don't know, depends. And then another person cheers you up in somewhere, you go for a walk, and then it goes again. Right? So you can see it's just a play of the mind, right? That afflictions are not always present. That's just a play of the mind, So that's kind of kasa. The second reason why afflictions can be eliminated, because they're just momentary. They're just temporarily depending on causes and conditions, right? Then the third reason why you can eliminate afflictions is because the afflictions are not in accordance with reality. You know, when you get angry at a person, you only think about the faults of the person, and you don't like to see the qualities. So that's not in accordance with reality, right? That's with anger. You overestimate or superimpose the faults, right? With attachment is the opposite. Yeah, attachment or strong desire overestimates or superimposes the qualities and doesn't like to see the faults. You know, that you have, oh, these expectations, oh, I have this, oh, I will be so happy because of this. So the stronger the desire is, the more qualities you put on your object. But it's not with the object, it's just in your mind, right? You create this mental image, and then you believe that to be the reality. Yeah? So that means that afflictions are not in accordance with reality. Yeah, that's reason number 3 why afflictions can be eliminated, because if you have a correct form of consciousness, you can eliminate a wrong one, right? So as we know from the train example, you see some movement in your eye, corner of your eye, and then you think, oh, we're moving. But then you look at a platform, you realize you're not moving by a correct form of consciousness. And then your friend tells you, oh, we're moving, right? You say, no, because I don't believe it anymore, because I saw reality. Yeah. So in a similar way, all wrong forms of consciousness you can eliminate with understanding reality. And that's even more true when you realize emptiness. Yeah, because the root of all these problems that we're going to talk about also is this ignorance, right? This grasping at from its own side existing I and mine. Yeah, so we're going to talk about that. The root cause of all afflictions is what we call, I drop down the term now and then we discuss it, the view of the transitory collection. You think, what? Some people might think, what? Some people heard before many times and say, okay, yeah, sure. But some people, they knew, and then it's kind of, what? The view of the transitory collection. Yeah, so there's a view, is a kind of, you think certain things exist in a particular way, right? That's what we call the view. Transitory collection means your body and your mind. Yeah, we have 2 aspects there. You have a body and your mind, or the 5 aggregates, as we say. Yeah, we can summarize in the body and the mind. Yeah. So that exists. Your body exists, your mind exists, right? But then what happens? On this mere collection of your body and your mind, you think there's an I there. When you get angry, you know? When I trigger your anger because of your hairstyle or dress or glasses or headphone, maybe not. But yeah, I can trigger your ego, you know, it's possible. You can really play with people's egos. In the monastery we do that a lot. When I was just new as a Westerner, because in the West we don't do that much, you know. I mean, it doesn't happen at all, I think. But in the monastery it's very, very good part of the training. It's not easy, I tell you. Because when there's a person who finds your weak points, right, and then triggers that, you know, either it's about food or moving things in the room or talking in a particular way, and then you get irritated, yeah, and you get a little bit of, the I comes up and the ego comes, anger comes and say, hey, look, you're getting angry. Where is that ego? You know, straight away. They tell you straight away. They just play with it, you know. So the persons in debate courtyard, which is a very interesting aspect of dealing with very difficult points in philosophy, and it's kind of, if you a little bit strong ego, you're the center of attention. People crack you down, you know. And then you're a strong ego and you think you have it right and they prove you're wrong, the whole crowd will shout together, you are finished, you are finished. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And it's not 1 or 2, it's a very nice play. It's like, let's say there's 20 people standing and you're sitting, right? So they're facing down on you, you know, and there's 20 who actually lead the debate, right? And they cheer up the whole crowd, you know. 1, 2, 3, you're finished. And everybody shouts at the same time, you are finished, you made a mistake. So the whole community knows you made a mistake, right? So it's very good for the ego, I tell you. But then when a person gets a bit irritated, then even more they play with it, right? So they can see it's rooted, right? The irritation with anger, desire, exactly the same thing, right? Is rooted in the concept of an I. there is a body and a mind, right? But then we think there is an I on top of that, or a self on top of that. And that's the root of the problems. That's what the Buddha said. That's that ignorance of the view of the transcendental collection. We're going to talk about it more. So the transcendental collection is the mere collection of the body and the mind, which exists, right? But then you view that in a particular way. You view that in a way there's an I and a self there. Yeah, so that's, and you can see in all forms, it's not only a Buddhist thing, right? In the scientific research, a narcissistic person is being considered as a person with a very, very difficult emotional life. So that's science. There's a lot of science in various fields of behavior science, in psychology, and even in science of management. It's very clear. The more narcissistic, or even in politics, the more narcissistic a person is, the more causes for problems for themselves and the people they work for, or they depend upon. It's very clear. It's very clear in science, that the stronger the ego is, the stronger the problems, So that's what the Buddha already pinpointed down 2,500 years ago, that this view of the transitory collection, meaning there is a mere body and mind that exists, right? And we know it exists because we have the experience of the body, we have the experience of the mind, but then thinking that on top of that, and superimposes on top of that, or thinking there is an I and mine you want to protect, or when you're close to death, for example, or you imagine you follow a ship in the middle of an ocean and you're lost, and you will die out of fatigue, right? Or you in a plane and the plane is going to crash, just within a few minutes. Then there's a very strong sense of a self you want to protect, and that's why people start screaming and want to. People get very emotional in those periods because there's a strong I. But if you're going to die, you're going to die, right? We have died so many times. It's not difficult. It's kind of, it's just your conscious leaves the body and you go in another form, right? So it's kind of, But so that's the view of the transcendental collection. What the Buddha said is the root cause of all suffering. We come to that. We come to that. So that if you eliminate that aspect, then the afflictions do not arise. So because the afflictions are rooted in this sense of a self, or sense of an I or ego, right? And because of that we get emotional, a negative thought comes, and whatever negative forms of sufferings, or depression, low self-esteem, anxiety, fear is all rooted in this sense of a self. That's pretty clear. And that's true for all the afflictions. Attachment, desire, jealousy, pride is very much rooted in this sense of an ego or self. So the Buddha said, if you give up that, then you have a real true cessation. So the third noble truth, true cessation, means various states of mind that are free of afflictions, right? That's what we call true cessations. Then the ultimate cessation is nirvana. So nirvana, or liberation, is not up there in the sky or something like that, There's a song now in my head, about it up in the sky. There was a song like that, but I forget. So there's no nirvana somewhere in a location. Nirvana is a quality of the mind, right? So that means the absence of afflictions. The absence of all afflictions is what we call nirvana. So that means it's a quality of the mind. So how do you reach that nirvana, and how do you reach the cessation? So that's noble truth number 4, is the true paths. So in a similar way, you see there's a problem, you analyze the nature of the problem. Then you want to analyze the cause of the problem. Then you want to analyze if it's possible to solve the problem. Then the fourth question is, how do you do it? Right? So the fourth noble truth is the methodology, or the method, or what we call the true paths. So you have suffering. The Buddha said you should know suffering. Then you have the cause of suffering, and the Buddha said you should eliminate or abandon the cause of suffering, right? And then the Buddha said you should manifest the true cessation. You should make it happen, the absence of afflictions in your mind. So then you ask the question, Or you say, okay, it's possible to get cured. So then you ask the question to the doctor, how do I do it? What is the treatment? Yeah, so also with the Buddha, same thing. You have a sickness, you have suffering, you have the cause of suffering. You know it's possible to eliminate suffering. So then the question is, how do I do it? Yeah, so that means the true paths leading to the true cessation. Yeah, so in the Four Noble Truths, you can see the first two truths, actually they cause and effect related. Because the second truth, the cause of suffering, produces the first one. Yeah, suffering. Yeah, so the cause produces the result of suffering. Yeah. So in the first two truths, you see a cause and effect relationship there. So the first two truths are actually related with samsara. How do you go around in samsara depends on the first two truths, right? Because if you have a cause of suffering, you have suffering, right? So if you have the second truth, second noble truth, the first truth will come into being. Yeah, so there's a cause and effect relationship. Although the way the Buddha taught it was slightly different. He said first to wake people up. That's why he first talked about suffering. Yeah? And then you have a question, how is it being caused, right? But from the point of view of cause and effect relationships, that if you have the cause of suffering, then the result, suffering itself, will come into being, right? So that means the first two truths are cause and effect related. Yeah? In a similar way, the last two truths are also cause and effect related. Because if you have the truth number four produces truth number three. Yeah, it's not too difficult, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So, yeah. So, noble truth number 4 produces noble truth number 3, right? Yeah. So the true paths creates or establishes the noble truth number 3. Yeah? So the Buddha said you should know suffering, you should eliminate the cause of suffering, you should manifest the true cessation, and you should meditate on the true paths. Yeah? So the fourth noble truth, the Buddha said, you should meditate on the paths. Yeah? So what are the paths? What is the method that leads us to cessation? What is the method that leads us to nirvana? What is the method that leads us to the absence of suffering? What is the method that leads us to eliminate afflictions? Yeah? So that's the fourth noble truth, right? The true paths. So then, what is that? Do you remember? Yeah. So when we talked about refuge, we talked about refuge that the actual refuge or safe direction is the Dharma jewel, right? And the Dharma jewel was twofold, meaning the absence of suffering and the method that leads to the absence of suffering, meaning the direct realization of emptiness. Yeah, so we're going to talk about that much more, more than you want, maybe. Yeah. So emptiness is very, very essential. Yeah, so the realization of emptiness, and then a direct perception of emptiness, leads to the true cessation. Yeah. So why is that so? That's a big question. Why do you need to realize emptiness? And what is emptiness? We come to that later when we have a model on emptiness. But yeah, just to get a picture complete, we just talked about the cause for suffering, right? The cause for suffering is karma and afflictions, right? So the direct cause for suffering is what we say karma and afflictions. But the root cause for suffering is this ignorance. Yeah? So this ignorance of this view of the transitory collection. Yeah? So the transitory collection is this mere collection of your body and your mind, right? That's why we say collection. Transitory because it's momentary changing. Your mind is momentary changing. Your body is momentary changing. So the view of the transitory collection is creating all those afflictions, because if you get angry or strong desire that arises is rooted in this sense of I and me, right? So, or we say traditional I and mine, so that the view of the transitory collection is this ego grasping and holding on to this self is the cause for all the forms of afflictions and suffering. So that has to go. If you take away that building block of the afflictions, then you're done. Yeah, so then, then you're really done. Because if you eliminate ignorance, there is no building blocks for the destructive emotions or the afflictions anymore. If there's no hold on to an I, then there is no, how dare this person say this to me? I am not like that. And then getting irritated. Or I need this, I need that. So if you realize there is no, from its own side existing self, as we call it, yeah, that's how it appears when you get angry or when strong desire arises. So if you see it, it's not there the way it appears, then you actually take away this ignorance. Yeah? And then initially you sit down and you think about it back and forth, and then you do that for a few lifetimes, and then you get some calm abiding on the side, and then you get the special insight, and then over time it becomes a direct perception. You see emptiness as you see the color and shapes with your eyes. That's kind of a very profound a very profound realization. Is still a bit far away, But don't think, oh, it's too difficult, so far away. I will never be able to do that. Don't think like that. Think you can do that. Yeah, everybody can do that. Yeah? That is very important. Emptiness is difficult, but you have to go for it because that's the way out. So that's, as I said before, from now on, whenever you hear emptiness, you sit ready, yeah. And don't think, oh, difficult, and make your mind dull or something, or get distracted, or put yourself asleep, or whatsoever. Don't do that, yeah. Just whenever you hear emptiness, you think, yes, this is the key. And that's very important, because emptiness is very difficult, is very challenging. The first teaching I was listening to, emptiness, I also didn't have a clue what's going on. And I just took anyway, so it's, I still don't have, I wouldn't say I have a clue, but this is not easy, so it takes time. Yeah, so it takes decades to understand emptiness, so that's also important to have that long-term vision, right? Yeah, so what I said many times before, though we're discovering Buddhism, but it's good to discover the path, and that means that, you study discovering Buddhism for, 2 years, right? Yeah. Then you can do another course called Exploring Buddhism. We're going to offer next year, for example. There's only 1.5 year at the moment, 1.5 year or something, or 2 years. We condense the present Exploring Buddhism in a more kind of, way. So anyway, you do that for a year or two, and then there's another course called the Gaza. Basic program or something. It's not that basic, but yeah. So it's just an idea, right? So you study, let's put it this way, you study for a few decades, right? Or a decade or two. Then you put it into practice for a decade or two. Then you do that for a few lifetimes, and then your understandings become very, very stable. And then the realizations will come. So if you have that view, then I can shake your hand and say, yeah, you're part of the team, so to say. Because that's really true, you have to have a long-term vision, otherwise short-term benefits are there, but things are going to take time, right? It's not easy to subdue your mind and getting less angry, for example, right? So that takes a lot of time. So if you have this long-term vision, then it makes the mind more peaceful that I'm on track, I'm going the right direction, and I keep going like that. Then it's easier to keep going, because otherwise you try, things don't go, and difficult, and then you give up, right? So that's you have to be careful, because the mind is very tricky. We have all these negative thoughts in our mind that makes us believe, oh no, I shouldn't do this anymore, it's all difficult, anyway. But it's better to have a difficult life and doing something about it than having a difficult life and not doing anything about it, right? So these kind of courses will definitely help to understand the root of the problems and to deal with it and then move on, right? That's very important too, and very fortunate, because most people, they just have no interest in spirituality or no interest in changing their mind, for example. So we're very fortunate, in one way, extremely fortunate to be able to have interest in not just a little bit of change of the mind, but even to the far extent of how to eliminate samsara and how to accomplish nirvana, right? So that's kind of very fortunate, in one way. There's not many people, You just have to go to the local pub and repeat what Namdak said, and people think you're completely crazy. Yeah, it's true, right? It's quite difficult to find people with the interest we can talk about at the moment, So it's very rare. So very fortunate. Yeah. Okay. So to summarize, the Four Noble Truths, it talks about the suffering. Buddha said you should know suffering, right? This all-pervasive aspect of suffering that should be abandoned. Yeah. And then the Buddha said you should eliminate or abandon the cause of suffering, being karma and affliction. Karma and afflictions are the direct cause of suffering. That's another interesting terminology. Karma and afflictions are the direct cause, and the root cause is ignorance. Yeah, because it's all rooted in ignorance. If you cut a tree, yeah, and you don't take out the roots, it will grow again, So that means you have to take out the roots. Yeah, so you have to take out this ignorance. Yeah, this fundamental cause for suffering. Yeah, without taking that out, suffering is going to repeat itself. So that's you should know suffering. You should abandon the cause of suffering. You should manifest the true cessation, and then you should meditate on the true paths. And the true paths is to understand that this I, or this ego, does not exist the way it appears. So that's kind of an aspect of emptiness we're going to talk about more in another model later on. But it's important to already know because of the structure. Right? So if you see, there's a body and a mind, right? We have a body, we have a mind. This momentary changing. And then when you get angry or when strong desire arises, there's a strong sense of an I that appears. So there's this view of the transitory collection, you could say. But if you analyze, where is this I? If you analyze from the tip of your toe to the crown of your head, and you go back and forth and see what's there in the body, all the various bones and organs and muscles and skin and vessels, this kind of blood vessels. There is no concrete, from its own side existing I to be found anywhere in this body, right? Yeah. So then also in your mind, if you see your mind is even more impermanent in a momentary changing nature, you have one thought comes, another thought goes, there's a feeling, there's perception, there's constant flux of sensory perception, there's mental consciousness, various forms of feeling, and various thought patterns come and go. So even in the mind there is a lot of kind of things happening. And in that momentary changing nature of these various aspects of the mind, there's no solid I to be found, right? The way the I appears when you get angry or strong desire arises. So then you come to a conclusion, it's not there. It can be a bit scary. Yeah. That doesn't mean there's nothing there. Doesn't mean there's nothingness, right? Because there's a body and you just have to bang your head against the wall and there's a body, right? Yeah. So that means there's perception, there's feeling, there's a body, but there's no solid entity existing from its own side. That's what we're talking about, right? That self, what we say, does not exist, and what we call emptiness. Emptiness means empty of something. You cannot just say, you always have to refer to something, right? The emptiness of the elephant, for example. If you don't know how an elephant looks like, and I tell you, this room is empty of an elephant, you say, what? Because you don't know how an elephant looks like, right? So then you cannot really talk about the emptiness of an elephant. So when we say emptiness, then we say it's empty of this concrete from its own side existing I and mine. There is no from its own side existing self to be found in your body, in your mind, separate from your body and your mind, right? So then you come to conclusion, this I is not there. Yeah, we are empty of this I. Does it make sense or not? So that's what we call emptiness, right? Yeah. So then initially you sit down and struggle and think about those things again and again and again. That's all still conceptual consciousness, right? When you sit down and think, we working with mental images and reasoning back and forth. It's not here, it's not there, it doesn't exist the way it appears, So that's conceptual consciousness. Yeah. Then over time, yeah, over time, maybe I drink something. Over time, when you habituate your mind to this kind of understanding or realization eventually, then it becomes what we call a direct perception. You see emptiness as you see things with your eyes, so clear. And that's what we call a direct perception of emptiness that eliminates this ignorance. Yeah, so we still have quite I wouldn't say a long way to go, but quite some way to go, right? It's not, we cannot say, okay, you do 2 years Buddhism, discovering Buddhism, and you get enlightened already, so that doesn't work. Some people have this kind of weekend courses, they have to pay a lot of money, and then you get kind of enlightenment right there or something like that. So we don't believe in that, because, to train your mind takes a long time, right? You can get insights, but to completely train your mind and have absence of suffering, full stop, without being reversed, that takes a long time, right? Yeah, so that needs time. Yeah, so that's important to get clear. Yeah. So what we talked about today, the Four Noble Truths and the 3 types of suffering. Yeah? So the suffering, the suffering of change, and the all-pervasive form of suffering. Yeah? And we also talked about, regards to the all-pervasive form of suffering, the direct cause for suffering is karma and afflictions in general, and the root cause of suffering is this ignorance. Yeah? So the root cause is this ignorance of grasping at this self, so to say. Yeah? So that's very important to get out of today. Yeah. Because all the other afflictions, they rooted in this ignorance of grasping at itself. Yeah? For example, attachment is rooted in this I and mine. How dare this? So, for example, I need this, I need that. Yeah. For example, I didn't use example sometimes, so I can use it again. So you're on a terrace somewhere, and you and your 4 friends or 5 friends, you bought exactly the same mobile phone. The same type. Let's say it's an expensive one. I think Apple is the most expensive one, right? So then you have exactly the newest of the newest. All 4 of you have exactly the same phone. So they're all there on the table next to your drinks, and then the waitress comes, and the waitress is a bit kind of a waiter and waitress, right? So anyway, either of those 2 come, and they're a bit clumsy, yeah. And then they put the drinks there, and whoops, and then they turn over the table, and all your phones, they drop on the floor. And then one is broken. So what appears to your mind at that time? It's not, I don't hope it's the other's phone. I hope it's not my phone, right? Yeah. So that's you can see, that attachment is related also with a sense of an I. Yeah. So you can see that various aspects, or let's say you buy a new car. Yeah, you have a showroom full of, let's say there's 4 exactly the same cars, right? Yeah. And then one boy comes and throws stones at the cars. You haven't bought the car yet, so you think, oh, that's not nice. And then you just walk away, right? Then you buy one of those 4 cars. Yeah, so let's say the second one in line. And so the car is still more or less the same as before. Of course, momentarily changing, but it's actually the same as before. But your relation with the car has changed, because now you signed a contract and you bought it. So now this boy comes again and throws stones, also at the second car. And the moment you throw stones at the second car, you react completely different than before, because it correlates with this sense of mine, my car or my phone. So that you can see that there's an attachment that doesn't like your object to be damaged, right? And then because it gets damaged and you don't like that, you generate aversion or anger, you see? So that attachment as well as anger, both of them are basically rooted in this sense of my car or my phone. So that's very clear, right? That correlation between those 2 aspects is very clear, So that means that as long as you've this grasping at this mine or I, or when somebody criticizes you, you say, I am not like this, I don't make any mistakes, that you can see there's a very strong sense of a self or I that triggers irritation, that triggers attachment, that triggers pride, same thing. Yeah, if you have a lot of pride, then it's such an obstacle to getting more knowledge or improving yourself. If you think you're already quite something, then you will never look at your own faults, right? Yeah, so that pride is an incredible obstacle to development, you know. Yeah. In a similar way, jealousy is also one important affliction, as we talk about. Jealousy is also extremely stupid, you know. Yeah, we're sometimes very stupid, you know. When you're jealous at a person, that person you think, oh, this person, ooh. But that person actually doesn't know you're jealous at him or her, and it has listen to nice music or whatsoever, and it's quite comfortable, and you're just like, yeah, you can see you only have yourself. It's very jealousy, it's very stupid. You see that? Yeah. But it's also related with a sense of a self, right? Very strong sense of I, you know. Yeah. So you can see that many afflictions we talk about, they're very much rooted in this kind of sense of an ego or a sense of a self, as we call it. And then it's not just an ego or a self, but that seems to exist kind of as an aspect from its own side, without dependence. That's how it appears. But nothing exists without dependence, right? If you analyze in your body, in your mind, or you take science into account, quantum mechanics, whatsoever, you see everything is related with each other, you know. And also David Bohm, a physicist, came to the same conclusions. It's very interesting that he said this self-identity or this self-deceptive thought, as he calls it, is a cause for making a distinction between us and them, and makes a distinction between our security and our power, and we are more important than them. Yeah, so he said there's a cause for problems in society. So he's a physicist, right? Very interesting. But then the same physicist, David Bohm, he then also says, which is even more striking, especially from the point of view of a Buddhist, he says this self-identity or this self-deceptive thought is just a show. It's not really there. But a very convincing show, and that's why people take it as an apparent reality. It's a very interesting statement, you know. That means that he realizes nothing exists substantial from their own side, not even the self, right? And if you follow that from its own side existing self, there's problems. But if you analyze, basically, it does not really exist the way it appears. You know, so he comes to that. But most people take it for granted. It's a reality. That's what he says. People think it's an apparent reality. You know, so that's very interesting. Even scientists, they come to very similar conclusions. Or David Hume, one of the Scottish philosophers, as you know, he came to very similar conclusions, right? In his book, The Nature of Humankind. There's one chapter on the identity of a self. Very, very interesting. Where he talks about similar things. That when he says it's very subjective. I cannot say it's true for everybody, but in my mind, he says, it seems to be appearing this strong sense of a self. But when you analyze it, you cannot find it anywhere. It's very interesting. Yeah. So, David Bohm and David Hume. Yeah. So there's many other aspects you can analyze. So yeah, from the Buddhist perspective, we say that is the cause for problems. That is the cause for the afflictions to arise. So you have to, what we say, the true paths, the Fourth Noble Truth, is the mind that realizes the absence of this self that does not exist. So it realizes this I does not exist. Not the I does not exist, but this inherent from its own side existing I, or this inherent from its own side existing self, that does not exist. There is a body, there is a mind, but not that solid existing from its own side. Yeah, so that realization eventually will bring you to liberation. Because if you take away the ego, you know, then if you take away this aspect of holding on to itself, then all these destructive emotions which use the building blocks of these concrete forms of existence, they lose their potential, right? They cannot, if you see everything as a nature of dependence, if you see everything is the nature of cause and effect, if you see there is no solid entities to be found in your body, in your mind, then those destructive emotions or afflictions will automatically become less. Because if there's no strong I, then there's no strong desire. If there's no strong I, there is no strong anger. So that's very, very clear, not only in the Buddhist teachings, but also in scientific types of research or science by itself. Look at people like physicists, David Bohm, for example, right? It's very interesting material that you can see that the Four Noble Truths of the 2,500 years ago explained by the Buddha is, in one way, it's very sophisticated. Like you have a problem, and you know the cause of the problem, and you know it's possible to solve the problem, and you have the methodology to do it, right? So kind of a complete kind of, how do you call it, package, so to say, yeah. I feel I'm selling the Four Noble Truths at the moment to you, but it's in one way, it's reason-based, right? It makes sense, in my mind it makes sense, so that's kind of very much reason-based, logical, and then you can see, why is it possible? Or you can see, first of all, why are we suffering? If you understand the first two truths well, you see why are we suffering in samsara. If you understand the last two truths well, you see why is it possible to eliminate it. The potential we have to eliminate suffering is because of these last two truths, right? So it's just a matter of fact of putting some effort in that direction, and there you go. Yeah, so let's stop there. That's a very happy ending of today. Yeah, the way out of samsara and go to nirvana. Yeah, so if there's any questions, then we can talk about that. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for coming, all of you.
Yeah.
Basically, if is the suffer not good for our spirituality development?
Ale.
Pardon?
Yeah, no, I say ale. There's a kind of I would say that's a stop word in Tibetan. Don't worry about it. When I say ale, just don't worry about it, because I lived in the Tibetan community for 2 decades, so I say ale or what else.
What does that mean?
Huh? Gasa. Yeah. It's just.
You get it.
It's a bad habit. So suffering by itself, that's what the Buddha said, right? We learn from suffering, right? So that means you should know suffering, but you should examine it in a correct way. If you just experience suffering and think, I have to learn from this without doing anything with it, then you don't really learn much from it, right? So that means you have to, when you see the suffering, then you have to know, how is this caused? Is it possible to eliminate this cause?
So we have to have a war to suffer, to develop.
No.
But that's what happened right now.
Yeah, that's true, because that's because of karma and afflictions, but it's better not to have suffering, right?
But apparently it's good for the human to develop.
If they use it, yes. But if they don't use it in the way we discussing in a very constructive way,
We go backward.
then they repeat the same thing, right? So that's the thing. It's not just you learn from suffering by just having suffering. You learn from suffering what the Buddha said, know the root cause of it. You should know suffering, the Buddha said, you should know how it's been caused. What is this all-pervasive form of suffering? And then you can do something about it, then you eliminate it, right? So then you learn, but if you just have suffering and think, I have to learn from this, then that by itself doesn't solve the problem, right? So you have to analyze it and check it out, and then there's a way out. And that's what we talk about, right?
Okay, this is going to be very cheeky to ask a second question.
Yeah.
Basically, to kill the ego, we are ego. We can control the ego, but we cannot live without the ego. It's impossible.
Depends.
Ego can get you somewhere good or somewhere bad.
Yeah.
But it depends how you navigate it, I believe.
And it depends how you... And depends... We back? And depends? And depends? You can hear me? Yeah. So it also depends, because I don't know, they can hear me online? Yeah. Hello? Yeah? It's okay? Raphael, you can hear me okay? Yeah? No, great. Yeah, so 1 sec. Got it. Hello? Now it's better or not? Was better? A little bit better? A little bit up. Hello? Yeah, we there? Sorry. Yeah, it's okay now? Raphael, it's clear? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. So it depends on, because we also have this kind of, I am going to become a Buddha, right? I am going to transform my mind. I am going to be a better human being, right? So that I am going to be a better human being, you could say that's an ego. You could say that is a self, right? But that is a conventional self, in the sense, if you grasp at a self that exists all from its own side, yeah, that ego is destructive, right? But this conventional ego of, I'm going to be a better human being, that's a constructive one, right? So it's important to know, to make a distinction between which ego we like to abandon, or which self we actually abandon, and which ego or self we see as a constructive aspect, right? So that's important to know. So when we talk about emptiness, or the lack or selflessness, for example, then we talk about a self that exists, seem to exist from its own side, that is the cause for all these problems. That we have to eliminate, right? But this conventional self that wants to change, that wants to become a better human being, that exists, that we don't eliminate, right? That's important to get. Yeah, is that clear? Yeah, because that, especially when emptiness is being taught for one of the first times, then it's very easy to get a misunderstanding of that, right? So we have to clearly understand which self or which ego does exist, and which self or which ego do we refute, right? So that's a very important aspect, right? Yeah. So that means that the ego that is, for example, in other light, put it beyond emptiness, an ego that is based upon kind of a self-cherishing attitude, self-importance, and not thinking about others, that ego is not very constructive, right? So that's kind of an ego we like to transform or refute, so to say, right? But the conventional ego or self that strives to be a better human being and help the world, that's a very constructive one, right? So, and that's a conventional aspect. Yeah, so that's important too. So then when we go into the model on emptiness, these things become hopefully a little bit more clear. You know, what actually do exist, which ego does exist, or which self does exist, and which ego or self does not exist, right? So that's important to get that distinction clear. Yeah? Just hang in there, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there is the big question on how information travels over time.
Yeah.
And if I heard correctly, you said that part of it is by karma, but then you used the word part, and I'm just curious to know how
How does it happen?
Yeah. So no. In addition to karma, what else?
Oh, in addition to karma, what else is information that
Yeah,
carries
because you
over time?
said part of it is karma, so I wonder what else.
Okay, yeah. So, for example, in Buddhist philosophy, in particular one particular school we call the Prasangika school, it's kind of the most subtle school of Buddhist philosophy. There's a very interesting aspect or explanation of karma, right? That is kind of, that when an action comes to an end, we do something physically, either good or bad, or we say something good or bad, right? Or we think something good or bad. Those three activities, when they come to an end, that information is not lost. Same if you look at the screen, and then you look at the wall, right? Your eye consciousness perceiving the screen ceases to exist. But the information is not lost because you can remember. Yeah. So then, this is how actually, also another aspect than karma is kind of information that is carried over time. So hyperdementia is a kind of an aspect of people who cannot forget. Yeah. So there's only very few people on the planet like that, but they exist. So they cannot forget in the sense you give them a date. They say, oh, it's this day of the week. I did this, the weather was like this happened in the news. They can give you answers for decades. That's a very interesting form of science, because there you can see that there is information the general public doesn't have access to that information, right? But these people with this particular capacity to remember, they're capable of remembering that. So that means that information, when we cannot remember it, that doesn't mean that information is not present, because there are people who can remember it, right? So that's kind of a level of reality what we call information, which is very high debated in any form of science, right? That what is information, how is it stored? Yeah, also with these kind of cases of these people who cannot forget, there's very interesting research been done, but they don't have the solution yet because, you know, neuroscience is very new, right? So it's very, very challenging what's happening. But there's a I thought that's very striking to see the science behind aspects of information that is available, but you can know, some people can access that information, other people cannot. Yeah, so that's another aspect which you don't really put straight away into the picture of karma, for example. It's just information you can remember, right? Yeah. But karma works very similar. That when an act, physical, verbal, or mental act comes to an end, that information is not lost, and that can trigger future states of mind or future forms of a sickness or suffering or happiness, for example. Yeah, so that's this information that is in the continuity of individual people that has the capacity to produce a result, right? So that's what we call with karma, kind of how information carries over time in relation with, you know, this other aspect which is not karma, but for example by people who can remember this in hypermencia, for example, you know. Yeah, it makes sense or not? Or you want to know more? Yeah.
No, it does make sense, but what I was curious to know is, in addition to karma, in the Buddhist perspective, how things get passed over time.
That's because karma is individual based, right? So the way you experience a particular food and the way your dearest friend experiences the same food is different. So that means there's a subjective aspect of experience. Yeah. And how is that caused? That's the question, right? Why is that difference there? So then we in Buddhism, we say, because we have individual streams of consciousness, and then in those individual streams of consciousness, you have because you do things different than other people. We are very individual, right? So that means we all do things differently, so we create different aspects of karma. Yeah? Either positive or negative. That's one aspect of karma. The other aspect of karma is that we say karma is definite in the sense that positive things produce happiness, negative things produce suffering. Yeah, so in a similar way, if you have the more the CO2 is in the atmosphere, the planet will heat up. That's a law of reality we cannot change. But we can prevent ourselves, if we're clever enough, not to produce too much CO2. So that means we cannot change that law, but we can play with the conditions. So karma is very similar. We cannot change the law that negative deeds produce suffering, but we can purify negative deeds, for example, or engage in more positive deeds. And then we live in accordance to that law of karma, and we develop. Because that nature or that law of reality of karma exists and we cannot change. But we can play it. So that means in Tibetan there is a saying, Tendel Jik, which means to organize or plan. It's maybe a better aspect. Organize or plan dependent origination. That means dependent origination, there's a law of reality we cannot change, but we can live in accordance to that law. Right? And that's exactly what the Buddha taught in the teachings on karma. Right? This is the reality, that's how things function, and if you want happiness, you do this, and you avoid that. So that's kind of, the teachings on karma helps us actually, and also the teachings on morality, helps us actually how to live accordance to that law and actually create more causes for happiness and eliminate the causes for suffering. Make sense or not? Yeah? Yeah. We come to that, do we come to that? Yeah. Morality we're going to discuss next week also a little bit more, yeah.
Hi. So my question is, if there is no self that inherently exists, then who realizes emptiness?
The conventional, merely imputed self. That's kind of a debate answer, right? Yeah. So that means there is a person meditating, isn't it? Or not? Yes or no?
Not inherently?
Not inherently, but there is conventionally a person meditating, right?
I hope so.
Huh? Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so. There is a person, yeah. So that means that there is no inherent self, but there is a self which is meditating. So that's what I said. It's very important to make a distinction between what does exist and what does not exist. There is no from its own side existing self without dependence. That's mostly how it appears. When you get angry or a strong desire arises, that appears a kind of a self that appears in a way without dependence, like unitary, all by itself, like a singular aspect, That's how it appears, right? If you analyze. So that cannot really exist because our body is the nature of dependence, our mind is the nature of dependence, so there's no place in existence for something to exist without dependence. So that's what we say does not exist. Nothing exists without dependence. Everything always exists by depending on something other than itself. So that's kind of an aspect of there is. Don't worry, there is a person meditating on emptiness, right? There is a person who has the realization, Yeah. Other example. You can wait a little bit longer for a few months or not? I mean, what is it? Casa.
October we do emptiness.
October, yeah. You can, So don't die before October, and then, because otherwise, to go straight dive into more aspects of that maybe takes time, right? Yeah. But I think for the time being, there is a conventional self, okay? Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
In order to fully liberate from samsara, does it mean that we should not constantly look for a better life? Just live as in what's ripening at that moment and being passive rather than being proactive is the question.
I mean, as I said before, if it's possible, it's easy to get liberated in one lifetime. We shouldn't worry too much, but unfortunately, that might be quite difficult. So we need a few lifetimes. Yeah. So then also, it's important to practice morality, for example, as we discussed in the model on the precious human rebirth, right? To practice morality in order to create causes for precious human rebirth. Yeah. Together with some prayers, that's very important. To say, okay, I'm striving for liberation or enlightenment, and for that purpose, I need a few lifetimes. So I pray and dedicate my merits by the practice of morality, by being a good human being, to again get similar opportunities in the future. So you need initially quite a few lifetimes, right? So it's important to have that prayer and create causes for precious human rebirth. Yeah.
Okay, Abalada, you have your hand raised.
Yeah.
Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, hello.
Oh,
hello
hi.
again, Geshe.
Oh,
Thank you.
You're very loud and clear, as we say. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, I think I have a similar question to many of the previous people have been saying. Like in the Great Perfection tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, the Great Perfection, the Dzogchen, and they talk a lot about pure awareness. And that which would be a very different thing from self-centered, let's say, egocentric perceiving, no? And and that relates to what you taught us at the beginning about the nature of mind, and spaciousness and clarity. So we know. Does that not exist on its own side? I mean, we are each a source of awareness, and I'm aware that I'm aware. That's what differentiates myself from other animals, basically. And all us humans are similar. So how does that fit into this scheme that you're sharing with us today?
So if you generate a subtle state of mind, which is basically the aspect of Dzogchen or Mahamudra, right? You by certain techniques, you generate a very subtle state of mind, And then, but that by itself is not enough. Although, if you generate a subtle state of mind, there is less suffering or no suffering, and there's a less stronger apprehension of a very concrete self, right? Because the mind is much more subtle. But it can be still, on a subtle level, can be still an apprehension of I am this consciousness, right? So even on a subtle level of subtle states of mind, the conventional mind exists. The experience of consciousness itself, or Rigpa, or clear-eyed mind exists. That mind exists, that experience exists, right? But there is no from its own side existing consciousness. And you see that also in Mahamudra, as well in Dzogchen traditions, that you check, where is this purity of the mind in the past, present, and future? So you cannot really find it in the past, present, and future in the sense existing from its own side, right? So that eventually that aspect has to be realized, right? You have to realize what we call the ultimate nature of the mind, in the sense of the mind being empty of inherent existence. Yeah, because that subtle state of mind also doesn't exist from its own side, right? Although being very subtle, it doesn't exist from its own side because the present is depending on the past and on the future, right? So there's this dependence there. There's no individual consciousnesses that exist all by themselves, right? So that aspect has to eventually be realized, that we call the emptiness of the mind. Yeah? That has to eventually be realized with this subtler mind you generate. Yeah? It makes sense or not?
Yeah, it makes a lot of logical sense, but not experiential sense. I think this lifetime I'm going to die, not being able to answer these questions for myself. But,
don't say that.
Yeah.
Don't say that. You're not dead yet, right? So you still have time. Yeah. So, for example, if you just meditate on the clarity of the mind, right? Just take that as an example, yeah. And you think that's me, right? And that's me, and I, and there's an appearance of this consciousness existing, or there's a feeling of it exists just not as a momentary aspect, but is just existing from its own side. This consciousness, this clarity. Yeah, so that's not really reality, right? Because if you think, oh, another second gone, oh, another second gone, oh, another second gone. So if you look into your mind and you see, where is this consciousness actually? Yeah, you cannot really find it as such in past, present, and future moments. It's just, what is consciousness is just a flux of moments, right? It's mere, or think about a river. I use more often this example of the river. You have the mountains, the snow is melting, right? And then little streams, they form together and becomes a river, and it goes into a lake, right? Let's say you sit close to the lake, yeah? Then when you look at the river, there's water there, right? Similar to the mind. There's a stream of water there. So same in your mind, there's a stream. But the moment you pinpoint an amount of water or mass of water or water molecules, whatever you like to pinpoint that, then that moves towards a lake, right? And it's not a river anymore, right? So with consciousness, it's very similar. If you look in your clarity of the mind, that just by the experience itself, you experience some clarity, but that clarity doesn't exist from its own side, right? Yeah, because every moment in that clarity is depending on the moment you say, oh, this is my consciousness, or it appears to be, oh, this is my clarity, right? So it appears to be my clarity, but actually the moment you say that, that's already past tense. Yeah, so in that way also you cannot really find a consciousness existing from its own side without dependence over time, for example.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
So sit back. Go back on your cushion after the session and check it out. Yeah.
I will. Yes, I will reflect on that a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Ablado. Jeff, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Geshe, for the teaching. A very interesting discussion. Various questions have come into my mind as the discussion has progressed, but I'll just stick to one thing, which is when you were talking about information not being lost. And I wonder if in near-death experiences, some people report what's called a life review.
Yeah, very interesting.
Not often of previous lifetime, but a life review of their current life. And do you think that gives some support to this idea about information not being lost?
That's an aspect there, and there's a Buddhist explanation for that as well, right? If the mind becomes more subtle, then there's much more clarity and ability to remember. So we see that, for example, if you achieve calm abiding, you have a capacity to remember so many more things, right? So that probably is very similar at a state of death, because when you die, then the coarser forms of consciousness cease to exist, right? Sensory perception stops, then coarser states of mind becomes more and more subtle, and then that's what they experience, this tunnel of light, for example, right? So, or this tunnel, and in the end is a light. There's very similar aspects as we talk about in Buddhism with the dissolution of the elements, so to say. Yeah, so various of those visions are very similar as we describe because that's the nature of consciousness. If you're Buddhist or not, or Hindu or Buddhist, it doesn't matter. That's the nature of our mind, right? Yeah. So that's same as the review of life, because consciousness becomes more subtle, then there's more capacity to remember, so to say. You know? Yeah. And that information should be there, otherwise you cannot remember it, right? So that proves in one way, same with these people with hyperdementia, is that they can remember things. That means that information should be there. Yeah. So there's few angles.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very interesting material. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah. All right. C'est ça for today. Okay. All right. Then next week, we continue. We have 2 more evenings about the Four Noble Truths. Yeah. And not only Four Noble Truths. Also, I was planning maybe, if people find helpful, I can make another sheet for the 12 links. Refuge, yeah? Then you have the summary, you know? So I put Four Noble Truths and 3 types of suffering as we discussed today. And then also the 12 links, then you have something to look at for next week, right? Yeah, I promise to do that, not tonight, but tomorrow or something like that, okay? Yeah. Okay, so let's dedicate in the sense that we have to achieve precious rebirths in future states of existence, and then also progress on the spiritual path to liberation and enlightenment. And we dedicate in those lines or with those thoughts, and make the dedication in that way. And think also that the dedication is also in nature of dependence, and that's exactly why the prayers come through, because now you create a cause for something to happen in the future, right? So that's also an aspect you can reflect upon while making the dedications. Yeah.
Dage jini sape kewa de tendang jowa kunla gangpen dang kepa jetsun losang jakpa ye tenpe nyingpo ringdu jaje zo. May the glorious Guru's lives be long and stable. May all beings equally in the extent of space have happiness. May I and others without exception accumulate merit and purify negativities, and may we be blessed to quickly attain Buddhahood. Tup ten chi dang jam gun gawe. Ten chu gya pela ga le rap zu pe. Sum den gu mi zen pa chu ki je da je ten pe pel du nyu jun shu. Je sem chu rin po che ma ke panam ki ge shi. Ki pa nyam pa me pa yang gong ne gong du pa wa shu. Tong ne ta wa rin po che ma ke panam ki ge shi. Ki pa nyam pa me pa yang gong ne gong du pa wa shu.
Okay, thank you so much for your interest, and then keep going like this.